becoming a therapist. I have also worked a lot with youths. Yeah, that's the coffee kicking youths. With youths, adults, couples, a lot of family work, probation, foster youth. I worked in wraparound for 8 years and also worked in the rape crisis movement for 5 years prior to becoming a therapist. So that's a little bit about me. So today, since I said we are going to be talking about some difficult things, I'm going to ask you to co-create a consent culture here, which basically means opt in, opt out. Everything is voluntary. If you don't want to participate in the discussions or any of the questions, that's totally up to you. If you also check in with yourself as we're going along, notice for any reactions, any needs that you have. If you need to step out, turn off your camera. If you need to take a bio break, any of that stuff, please take care of yourself. And then a trigger and content warning as well about the information. And self-care in the virtual room, in the room and beyond, right? So as we talk about heavy topics, just knowing that you might need a little extra time for yourself today or tomorrow to just be a little bit extra gentle and just notice what's coming up for you. And if it helps, use your resources, right? So some group agreements I've set out here, and I also encourage you all to add any, should you like to. Using I statements, so just speaking from your own experience, of course. Moving up, moving back. What does that mean, Roshni? It means if you're somebody who tends to not speak up or not participate as much, challenge yourself just a little bit to step up, move up. If you're somebody who tends to participate a lot, maybe stepping a little bit back for others to be able to step up. And as I mentioned, although it's worth mentioning multiple times, please take care of yourself, even if you just need a short pause to go outside, get some fresh air, stand in front of the fan or something like that, right? Use I statements twice, apparently. I've got it on here. Believe other people's experience. I think this is a key foundational aspect of what we're going to be talking about, is that we are talking about a lot of folks who don't have the same experience as us, right? So believing whatever that experience is, even if it doesn't sound like something that makes sense to you. Challenging yourself and taking risks as much as it is comfortable to do so. Noticing your positionality and your worldview, what you're coming into the room with, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Recognizing that this is ongoing work, that this is not a one and done, right? So we're here today to talk about it, knowing that this work continues on past this. All oppression is linked. That's an important one that is, again, a foundational piece of what we're going to be speaking about today. And intent does not always equal impact, right? So a lot of times we might have the best intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So as much as we may be coming from that place, it's also great to be open to hear that that might not be the impact. And in the same way, I invite you to also let me know if that's the case in here. Oops and ouch. This is a really easy way for you to be like, oh, that stung a little bit. This is great for Zoom. You just put a oops, ouch in the chat, like, oh, that kind of stung a little bit. It sort of is like a way to kind of, call someone in. Just say, you know what, that impact kind of hit me and I'm feeling something there, right? Practicing openness, awareness. I know all of you always do that, but just a reminder, practicing curiosity, asking questions, exploring any of the discomfort. I think discomfort really tells us that there's something going on, whether that's change or growth or something that we need to look at. Just paying attention to that. And it's worth saying twice, consent culture. This is opt-in. Consent is a very, very big word to me. So I think that even when we're talking about consent, we need to not just think about it in terms of sex. A kid should understand consent way before they even understand what sex is, right? Like, go hug your uncle, go do, just kind of that whole thing. All right. And then again, trigger warning, right? We're going to talk about some intense stuff. Anything else anybody wants to add to this? Anything I missed or something that might be helpful for you? Anybody on Zoom? Yeah. Feel free to put it in the chat or. People put stuff in the chat. Sounds good.
Yes, if we want to take a pause, we could screen share the Zoom folks.
Sure.
Why don't you say that on the microphone?
So we're going to screen share the folks who are on Zoom just to be able to, yeah. You want me to log on to Zoom?
Seeing them, do they vocally introduce themselves?
Yeah, just whoever's here. Okay, kid.
I'm gonna have a hard time.
Sure, sure. Of course. I think you have to turn up your volume though, because we turned it down so we can hear them on here.
On the Bluetooth?
Yeah.
They were-
Yeah, Beck turned the volume down.
Got it.
Yeah. Mhm. Good morning, Zoom folks. Can you introduce yourselves? I saw Jasmine. You want to get us started, Jasmine?
Hello, I'm Jasmine from Long Beach, California. Hello.
We can just popcorn, mute yourselves and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Paula Lavacat. I'm in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina.
Hi.
Hi, miss you.
Yes, you get too.
Good
Thought you-
morning.
Go ahead.
I'm Layla Samurai, and I'm from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Good to see you all.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Janina from Pennsylvania.
Welcome.
if there's-
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm in Columbus. Sandberg.
Hi.
And just tell them over break, we'll figure out a way to get them on the screen. But
Hi, I'm Alexis. I'm in Columbus. I'm going to stay off camera because I have COVID and I'm actually laying in bed. So,
Oh no, I hope you feel better. Take it easy.
Hi, I'm Monica from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm also off camera because my children will hijack the whole experience on a Saturday. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. Anyone else? Is that everyone? Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad you all could join. All right. So just a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So we are going to be introducing some of the underlying components to systemic oppression and providing ways to recognize, examine, and address oppression trauma. We're going to offer the opportunity for EMDR therapists like yourselves, consultants, and faculty as well, to recognize the intersectionality of our own experience and learn how to provide a platform for being trauma-focused. With clients, consultees, and trainees as well. We'll be breaking down the tactics of oppression and its daily impact, and this will assist with being able to identify our clients, trainees, and consultees' layers of identities while validating their trauma. In addressing our own experiences with privilege and oppression trauma, we will create room for our clients to be able to genuinely show up as their complete selves. With the foundation of more deeply understanding oppression, we're able to show up with a compassionate witness and hold space where healing from oppression trauma is possible. All right, so some of our objectives for today, and if you haven't signed in, by the way, for CEs, make sure you do that and that you sign out as well. So today we're going to be analyzing the layers, tactics, and impacts of oppression. We're going to identify and examine structural forms of oppression. We'll be distinguishing oppression trauma and the impact of it on your clients to be able to avoid re-traumatization as much as is possible, of course. We'll demonstrate ways to assist clients with understanding their intersectionality and their oppression trauma. We'll assess how using a trauma-focused practice can provide a foundation to address oppression trauma. And we will underline the importance of being a compassionate witness, investigate the connections between abuse, oppression, and trauma, discover a deeper understanding of privilege, and be able to identify your own privilege, identify how oppression trauma can be treated with EMDR therapy and the nuances that allow the healing of systemic oppression, And we will identify concrete ways to show up as an ally in providing EMDR consultation. Okay, so here's the deal. The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, to be seen, heard, and companioned exactly as it is. So I'm going to ask you to be a compassionate witness, both with yourself and going forward, right? What does this really mean? And this is some of the framework of what we're walking into, right? Just coming at it from this compassionate witness standpoint. So shifting paradigm a bit to, instead of what's wrong with you, to what's happened to you and what does healing look like to you, which is very much aligned with what we do here at ICM. So it's a shift of understanding and practices, and it's turning toward healing community and support for survivors. Atrocities refuse to be buried. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites for both restoration of the social order and the healing of individual victims. So I think that's an important thing. Is part of what we are really doing is we're holding space for people to be able to express that. Even with our consultees, right? We're holding space for people to be able to talk about their experience and have that witnessed and validated. So, some blocking beliefs. When we're talking about these things, a lot of blocking beliefs do come to the surface. And here are some of them that kind of came up. I don't see color. Aren't we all the same? Race is an illusion. Why are people of color so attached to this concept? Let it go. I'll just listen. I know I have a lot to learn. Besides, I'm likely to say something stupid and get nailed again. The fear of just not even wanting to touch the top, right? I don't know what I don't know. People of color need to teach me about race. Tell me what to do. Why are people of color so angry with me? I wasn't even living at that time. Sorry, I'm gonna read that one twice just because it's so good. I don't know how to have this conversation without feeling blamed, guilty, frustrated, or angry. Who's heard some of this stuff? Lots of nods. Okay. How about these? Right, so we're gonna talk about race. That means in addition to being disturbed by white people's ignorance, I'm gonna have to teach white folks what they choose to deny knowing, amnesia of whiteness. I'm angry about race, but if I talk about it, I'm labeled the angry person and no one listens. Right, we're going to talk about race. That means we're going to talk about Black folks and white folks. I'm neither. Why should I care? I'm invisible. I don't want to keep educating white people about race. They need to do this for themselves. Heard this? Folks have heard this, said this stuff, maybe? Yeah. Okay. So these are things that come up that get in the way of us being able to move forward with some of these discussions. And these are triggers, right? I mean, it's a little bit off-putting to hear these things. It's a little bit overwhelming. And we all have our own reactions, our own triggers to these types of statements, and our own feelings about this as well on top of it. So there's so many layers we're bringing into this conversation. So I just want to acknowledge that. Here are some of the blocking realities, unfortunately, and this is from Lipscomb and Ashley, so it's very specific to their writing. So EMDR therapy, like many treatment protocols, are often unknown or available to communities of color. That's one of the things I love about the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, is that we're actively working to change this. And so many of you in this room are really at the front lines making those changes. Yep. The therapists practicing EMDR are largely white and do not represent the racialization and marginalization of African American clients. Not my favorite word to quote, or words. I would say, and clients of color, right? And queer and trans clients, and non-cis clients, right? Sorry? Neurodivergent clients. Thank you. Exactly. White therapists who are not aware of the privilege and social location may not thoroughly understand their clients as racial beings, increasing their likelihood of inadvertently engaging in racial microaggressions. As a result, minority clients may perceive them as biased, prejudiced, and misattuned. Racial consciousness is a critical consideration, in white therapists' ability to effectively treat Black and other clients. I have to say, microaggression is not my favorite word. I think it diminishes some of the effect of those aggressions. I think microaggressions are actually quite macro. If I were to take a tack and poke you here all day long, you'd start bleeding. It would hurt. That's not a microaggression, poking someone with a tack. So in the same way, saying those things here and there, consciously or not, really does have an impact on folks, right? And that's where intention does not equal impact, right? So what is oppression? This is a big word we throw around a lot. We hear it a lot, and oftentimes it does bring up a lot of discomfort. So oppression is a systematic, institutionalized, pervasive, and routine mistreatment of and discrimination against individuals because of their membership in groups identified by by gender, race, religion, or faith, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, ability, neurodiversity, body size, language, tribal affiliation, and other differences or groups on the sort of downside of power. So we've got this nice little image here of intersectionality, right? And that's also another term that gets thrown around that might not be as clear. Any one person has multiple identities. And so what that person is bringing to the table is their intersectionality, right? And so, for example, I identify as an AFAB, assigned female at birth. I identify as a woman. I identify as an Indian person from India. And I have to clarify that because in 1492, some moron thought he was on a different continent. Anyway, I digress. And I'm also a lesbian or queer. So these are multiple identities that are overlapping and that make up my experience, right? And so that's really what's meant by intersectionality. So if you are someone who has privilege in a certain area, you can have prejudices, right? Excuse me. If you're someone who doesn't have privilege, you can have prejudices and you can experience those things, but it doesn't necessarily have the systemic back, right? So for example, I could say, oh, I don't like this race of people. And because I'm a person of color, that's a prejudice of mine. But when there are systems behind that, it leads to things such as discrimination, right? So discrimination can be several things, can show up in several different ways, bless you. One of the most important ones, which we're going to go into detail, that we do not talk about enough is ableism. It's still largely invisible. It's still largely the last thing on the list that we talk about. And this is treating non-disabled people as a standard, therefore excluding folks who have disabilities. So the assumption, I'm also going to add the invisible disabilities, which I think all of us know all too well when we're talking about mental health concerns. But there are other invisible disabilities that we might miss that are important for us to pay attention to. So again, there are systems backing this up, which is why we call it discrimination. Classism, discrimination based on class, often involving class superiority. Again, another one we don't talk about enough. That's very hidden in a way that things are out of sight, out of mind. If we are not driving through areas where we're seeing poverty, where we're experiencing classism, then we can stay invisible to it. We could talk about gentrification all day long, right? Upwardly mobile folks moving into neighborhoods that have less access, less resources, and changing them and making them unlivable. for folks who were there before. Unfortunately, in San Francisco, there is an epidemic of them burning down, landlords burning down their buildings to kick people out so that they can build up condos. There's a huge land grab there. It's very disturbing. I lived up there for 4 years, and every single person I know is out of the city now. Every queer person I know, every person of color has been pushed out. And the same thing is happening in Oakland. And you can say that of most cities, especially urban cities. You're seeing that a lot more. Over to the right, we have racism. So discrimination based on race, often involving race superiority. We don't have any of this in our country, right? That was sarcasm in case it didn't come across on the Zoom. So again, this is another trigger word. When we hear it, we kind of clam up. We have responses, we have triggers, right? Caste. According to UNICEF, caste discrimination is prevalent in India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Japan. They estimate it affects 250 million people. The caste system in India is the only one I can speak to, is the only one I have any experience with, is very rigid. It has shifted a great deal with globalization, to where there is a middle class now that never existed before. And it's very interesting the things that have shifted as a result. Now there are malls, now there are a lot of corporations there. You can see a McDonald's and a Pizza Hut, and there's a lot of things that weren't there before that are now impacting people and shifting the culture. Hopefully for the better. Ageism, another one that, all of these become invisible to a lot of folks, especially if you have privilege and it's not your experience, you can miss out on a lot of this. But with ageism, this is stereotyping of people based on age. Now, when we talk about ageism, I think we are thinking of elderly folks and adults, but we forget that children are actually pretty oppressed in that they don't have choice. They don't have control over their life. They don't even get to decide, what do I eat? What do I wear, for the most part, at a very young age.
Well. We let them sometimes with their outfits.
Okay, that's a big exception. Sure. Sure. And then, of course, elderly folks, another very invisible population. I'll talk a bit more later about how our society is obsessed with productivity. And as soon as you are not a person who's generating something, you are tossed to the side, right? Whether it's due to ability, age, or what have you. So sexism is the belief or attitude that one gender or sex is inferior or less competent or less valuable than others. So in this scenario, men are better than women, or AMAB, or assigned male at birth folks, are have more access than assigned female at birth folks. And I know you all know all these. I'm just going through them just as a review and just to get our mind in this kind of I want to say library. Get us in there, yeah. Sexualism. Interesting word. Treating heterosexuality as a standard, therefore excluding homo, pan, and asexual folks. Asexual folks weigh a lot. I think it's coming to the surface more, but for most asexual folks, there was not a lot of community, probably up until maybe the last 10 years or so. And it's still very much not in the average person's mind of what that is. The average person is not aware. It's not a thing that most lay people are familiar with. And a lot of myths about that as well, right? Asexual people like to be in relationship. They have connections and relationships, and it just looks a bit different. And also, usually we use the word heteronormative, assuming that everyone is heterosexual. It really drives me nuts when people say about their babies, oh, these two are going to end up married. You're like, they're babies. All right. And then sizeism. Discrimination based on body shape, such as We have a lot of fat. A lot. And I think people are breaking stereotypes and there are shifts occurring, but it's still largely the driving force of what we see when we pick up a magazine, when we turn on the TV. You know, we're seeing folks who do not fit a beauty standard that most people do. Cis sexism, the belief that trans or less authentic than cisgender people when physical and subconscious genders are the same. All right. So you all are all too familiar with trauma. You teach it, you understand it, you know it. We're going to go through some of the basics and how it's impacting this discussion. Knowing that you have a foundation, a great foundation that ICM has planted here, and knowing that we come from not just a trauma-informed culture here at ICM, but I would say trauma-focused. I would say that we're taking it to the next level. And as Jamie says, it's instead of it just being trauma-informed of like, okay, yeah, trauma is an element. We're looking at it as the element that is informing everything else. We're coming in with that assumption. As you know, trauma does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs within personal, social, political context of the person and their identities, race, class, disability, gender, language, sexual orientation, tribal affiliation, religion, immigration status, body size. That's one thing we didn't talk about, nationalism, right? If you weren't born here, if you are undocumented, I literally saw on the news last night, 6 illegals, blah, 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 whatever the end of the story. I was like, people are not illegal. That's not even a thing. So, yeah. Both victimization and oppression depend on myth and not fact. So the myths that stay alive are very damaging to folks and further reinforce trauma. And both trauma and oppression are about power and control, power over rather than power with. Here's my biggest pet peeve. Power. It's not oil. It's not a limited resource. There is plenty of power. This room is full of power. Take your own, and there's some for me, and there's some for you and everybody. So I can feel empowered in myself. You can feel empowered, and we can interact in that way versus I need to have power over someone. Often folks who think like that have a lot of insecurity about their own power and are trying to grab for something, which is not real. That's me. Right? So both have a traumatic impact. Both can change the definition or identity. So much of our identity is informed by these social constructs, right? And it changes our worldview. It really does. There are a lot of folks who feel like this is just not a safe place to exist, to be human, to be anywhere. And both send a message about the worth of the individual. I think that's one of the hardest things that we come across with our clients is those negative cognitions that get internalized as a result of the oppression, of the trauma of oppression, excuse me. So there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, said the great Audre Lorde. Again, I think that this speaks to intersectionality, right? There's so many pieces that I'm bringing to the table, that you're bringing to the table. It's not just a one identity that envelops all of our experience. That's why I hate when people get political and they're like, well, I am financially moderate or conservative. A lot of us don't have the luxury of saying those kinds of things or doing those kinds of things. A lot of us have reactions to the political climate because it literally becomes an issue of life and death. So the wheel of power and privilege. When we think about privilege, there are several aspects to that. And we've discussed some of them already, but I'll go into a little bit more here. And you're going to have the opportunity to take a little time to yourself to write down some of the areas where you experience privilege and some of the areas where you experience oppression. So in the center here is power, and you can see the groups as they go out. So We've got citizenship, right? So whether you're a citizen, whether you're undocumented, skin color, that happens across different communities. It happens across continents. I know in Indian culture, you will not walk into any store where you will not find Fair and Lovely cream, which is skin bleaching. Colorism. Folks with lighter skin tend to have more privilege. Formal education, access to education, right? Also a piece of classism. Ability. Sexuality. Neurodiversity. Mental health, which we all know too well. Body size. Housing. Wealth. And actually this says homeless, and I'm just going to correct that now we're utilizing the term unhoused, which I think is much more empowering because it's like you don't have a house. That doesn't say something about who you are actually. It's not a judgment, right? I mean, it is, I know, in our society, but it shouldn't be really. Wealth, access to resources, language, gender. And so in looking at this, let me see what my next slide is. In looking at this, there's so many elements of who we are. And this is a snippet. This is probably not completely inclusive. There are other elements in here that might need to also be identified. But this is a decent list. So let's dig deeper. If we want to address mental health, we got to get in there. We got to dig through violence, inequity, poverty, neglect, oppression, injustice, racism, trauma, mass incarceration, access to housing, healthcare is a huge one as well. Social and legal exclusion, socioeconomic status. There are so many layers. So I love this image that really shows us how we can dive into some of this stuff through a lens of intersectionality, as you can see with the shovel, right? And then you can see that the medical models in there, the DSM, which we all know and love, sarcasm noted, individualism, so toxic and so at the foundation of American culture. Big pharma, right? All of these layers, all of these systemic reinforcements of oppression. So let's take a few minutes to write down. I actually did not pass out paper. If you guys want to grab some paper in the back, there's little sheets of paper. And folks on Zoom, you're welcome to type or jot down some notes. So I'm going to go back to the wheel of privilege and have you take a few moments to identify the places where you hold privilege and identify the intersections of oppression that you experience. And we will have a few to kind of get together in smaller groups and talk about it a little bit. So I'll go ahead and leave this up and let's take about 3 minutes to go ahead and write down some of the ways in which you identify on this chart, if it's helpful. It's actually not my
You're all welcome. I actually. Oh, good. You know, I got all of my.
Everybody got paper? Need a pen? I'll give folks another minute. Better? Want to do breakout rooms. How many people are there? Maybe three groups of three. Yeah. Okay, so how was that? When was the last time you did that? Years. Yeah. What's that? 4 months ago? Okay, that's good. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Folks said about a year ago, 4 months. I've thought about it, but not done this exactly. I think that we can think about aspects of it, but in order to really be able to talk about intersectionality, it's helpful to identify all of the ways in which we show up. And I think that also can impact our clients and how we're working with consultees and trainees. So let's go ahead and get into groups of 3. And I'll give you about 15 minutes, 5 minutes each, to talk a little bit about how this felt to you, if there was anything that surprised you, and if you'd like to share some of the ways in which you have experienced both privilege, feel free. All right. So you've got until 10:20 Eastern time. Thanks. I'll just be like,
She wants to come on the screen. Okay, the breakout rooms should be 25 seconds. They must be like in their last.
wait, another minute.
None of them are back in the room. 16, 15.
Happy. Oh, no, just kidding. Wrong holiday. Exactly. Okay, so now we can see all the Zoom folks. So, Paula, stop picking your nose. No, I'm just-
Now I'm gonna do it here.
You're welcome to turn off your camera if you don't want to be on camera right now.
That was my
Folks,
10-year-old part.
we would love to see you. Not up Paula's nose, but yeah. So how was that? Thoughts? Anything you want to share? Please, Mike.
If it's extended, be sure to carry.
Oh,
the
yes.
microphone.
You gotta be like a dude.
Yeah. Well, typically I'm the poster child of privilege, right? White, male, cis, upper middle class. But it was the first time that it's hit me that as an autistic person, I've also been oppressed by every fucking class, every fucking group, you know? And Yeah, I didn't like feeling that, but it was nice to have it register.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for sharing. Tammy.
Hey. Hi Jasmine. Hi Paula. So two things. One, there's some things I wrote in both categories because some things I put in both categories because my like family background and upbringing would put it over here, my current state of being, and that kind of transitioning class and transitioning access to things and that sort of and then it was interesting. I said Susie, this is my first time writing down like I have these kind of chronic medical issues since having COVID. I've never actually written that down, like how that still like is impacting me. And it literally changes for people who live with chronic pain conditions. Not that I didn't think about that always, but it's definitely this kind of, I don't know, I appear fine and healthy. And then there are things that people can't see. And so I've never written, and I was like, damn it, Roshni, get out of here with this.
Thank you for sharing. And you bring up a great point, and that is that these are changeable things sometimes, right? Folks can go from undocumented to documented, from not having a disability to having a disability. As say that people will look at me and say, you're young. Why are you using the scooter in the grocery store? Why are, I get all kinds of looks at that. And really hard to be able to think about the fact that you're not seen in that part of it. It just adds to the pain of it, right? Yeah. Oh, yes. Go ahead, Layla.
It was really nice to be able to think about all the ways in which one is privileged, and then and especially as somebody who is usually not experienced in that way. One thing that I think is missing from that wheel is religion, just as I was beginning to think about ways in which I think that Christianity comes with a lot of privilege, and that's definitely an inner ring experience. And as somebody who tends to be more white passing, I noticed that when I put on my hijab, my experience with whoever I'm with varies greatly. So that's a huge piece. I was also telling my group members about how we were sitting together as a family and we were discussing our experiences with racism. So I was born in Baghdad, but I came to the States when I was 3 years old for my dad to do his PhD, and my family stayed. So when we were talking about our first time experiencing racism of any kind, I said, probably when I was 5 or 6 years old, that was my first memory with it. And my dad said, oh, I was 45. And so I felt like the experiences of individuals who immigrate, I don't think that they experience racism any less, but I think that in my experience, it's been because he and my mom felt so rooted to Iraq. And so they considered themselves almost tourists to this country. And as they settled in and started to see that they have a right to take up space, then they began to notice different experiences.
Thank you so much for sharing. Great point. Religion, spirituality is a one, and again, one that doesn't get talked about enough. And I think you bring up a great point that it is largely our view that impacts how oppression shows up in the day to day. So if, as you said, your parents were feeling like we're just visitors, we're just tourists here, then I can see how a lot of this can be ignored, and how much oppression are we desensitized to on the daily, right? And when our skin is a little less thick, we feel it even more. Jamie.
Layla, I agree with you 100% that religion needs to be on the wheel, and echo everything about Christianity, especially in this country, really having the privilege. And to that, I wanted to tie it into a question for you, Roshni. The definition you gave of oppression earlier, what I loved about it, loved about it, was that clause, groups on the downside of power. Because a lot of you know my feelings on this. we see a lot of Christian folk now saying, I'm being discriminated against because of my Christian beliefs. You're oppressing me because of my Christian beliefs, where, you know, Christians, I would say, in this country hold the seat of power, literally at a government level. So I don't know if you can give us any reference on where that came from, or if that's your original definition.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check back on the reference for that. I had it from a previous presentation. But I think you bring up a great point about Christianity and this assumption that everyone is Christian, not just here in this nation, but generally around the world, largely, right? And there's a lot of impact and influence. I can just say in parts of India, there are people whose name is like John Smith, and they look Indian, and it's very interesting. And so you see the impacts of Christianity in different countries for generations and generations, right? So there's that. In terms of the downside of power, what you're describing is gaslighting. It's just plain and simple gaslighting. To say that as a Christian person you're oppressed, or you're experiencing discrimination, that is where the key part is that all of the systems are set up to support Christianity. So if you're Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, or anything else, that's not represented largely. I mean, I know that media is representing more and more cultures, more and more religions, but Christianity is not on the downside of power. It is the pervasive power, not just in terms of religion, but in setting a lot of things. I think we can see that in this country, and we will be talking about reproductive justice today. We can see how some of these values of different religions are being placed into actual law. And I know that happens all over, and it looks different in different countries, but this country was built on this idea of the separation of church and state. And that's clearly not what's taking place.
So Olivia and I had a really good conversation, and I think one thing that came up for own like mental health work is when I was going to my own therapist, I think we both expected me to talk about the oppression that I had from being African American, which I definitely experience all the time. But the way I was socialized in my family and in my home around being Black was this very empowering model. And I don't think that I realized that being Black was like, knew that other people didn't like it, but like my interpretation of it really didn't impact me until I got to high school and college. What I realized I was carrying like of my own internal negative cognitions and like external cognitions was really around my diagnosis with a medical condition when I was 12. And most of what really impacted the way that I saw myself and the shame that I was carrying came around my inability to like access, but also the fact that other people couldn't tell, which was this weird people. I also was very annoyed where I didn't have I almost always go new buildings before I go because I want to know like how many stairs it is before I can get from the car to the parking lot, or if there's an elevator. And I was giving a presentation where I talked about that, and I don't think it recognized that like other people don't do this. But it's not something like I don't look like I need to find an elevator. Sometimes I don't need an elevator, but I'd like to know like what do I get into the building. I think even in my family, like we talked about being Black and what that meant and how impactful it was. And I people who like want to live, and I was like, I was taught that living the other way was the problem, which has a different set of issues. But it to me being sick both was very, very different in the way that other people reacted to me being sick. On the other hand, it's like we were talking about invisible illness and the shift that happened for me because I've always had lupus. But at work last year, I had to go to the emergency room and I had to have an emergency surgery. Suddenly, my lupus became significantly more valid to other people because I had this like medical crisis that was then documented was hospitalized, I had to out of work, like everyone had to find out, not because I wanted them to, but because that just is what I had to leave from work and go straight to the emergency room. Whereas before, I had lupus before, but people didn't treat me the same way. It was like this less valid diagnosis. And so when you live with an invisible illness, it's almost like you have this medical crisis that other people see in order for people to really honor and validate that experience, which is also incredibly expensive because in this country, if we can't, but I don't know, we just had a really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Erica. And that's a great point that, again, kind of highlights what Layla said about environment, right? So, inside your home, what is the belief? How are people showing up? And, how that impacts your worldview as well. So coming out into the world when you come from an empowered place and you don't realize, okay, all this stuff is happening, that level of desensitization, it's quite alarming when you start to tune into that stuff. And it is also your point about invisible chronic illness, chronic pain stuff is that you do so much and you don't realize how much masking you do, how much you're just trying to kind of be in that norm, not show people whatever's going on. And that's exhausting. And a lot of times we don't even realize that we're doing it because it's become the norm, but it's emotional labor. And it's overwhelming sometimes. Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, I was just really going to say amen to all of that because it's so true. We never know what another person's individual walk is in terms of what they're carrying, how they're feeling oppressed, how they're feeling excluded, the heavy weights that they're carrying and bearing on a daily basis. And often we don't even recognize how much internal challenge we have in dealing with our own oppressed areas of life. But like looking at the will that you presented was great. And of course, it's not all inclusive because we all have our different levels of shit going on that we're carrying that feel very oppressive. So we're not going to look at that wheel and always see ourselves on there, but we have to put our issues on there and give it light and give it visibility. But the other thing that I was saying in my group is that I don't always want to sit around and have a conversation about how the people in the room are feeling oppressed and how they lack privilege. It's like, I don't want to have that conversation of, yeah, I'm not, even though we all get to have our voice in that. But for me personally, in my own life, I have to think about the different layers of my own privilege. And I do consider my Blackness, my melanin to be a great privilege. But I need to think about that, yes, I am a citizen. Yes, everything is working relatively well. Yes, I have shelter. So thinking about the ways that I am privileged as opposed to at a disadvantage, because that's the shit that's like real every day. So it's like, I don't want to even look at all of those different ways. I want to talk about my privilege and talk about how I'm using my privilege, which I call superpowers, how I'm using those superpowers for good. What am I doing with my education? What am I doing with my able-bodiedness or whatever? So that uplifts me as opposed to like, yeah, we're in a world of shit because there's so much oppression. That's what I wanted to share. And thank you. This is great.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think looking at it as your superpower is great. And we're going to talk about allyship later on today. So that is a way that we can use our superpowers to be able to make change. Olivia had a question.
So I think this discussion was definitely really like eye-opening and kind of validating for me because I check most of the boxes of being someone who is very privileged from the outside. And I haven't necessarily like viewed myself as someone who is oppressed, but I also have some of the things that you can't see. You know, I've always had like significant learning disabilities that I've masked and that have showed up in different ways. And I have debilitating migraines that impact my life every day. And I'm constantly worried about like the level of noise and the lights and am I going to be able to tolerate this? And so just having this discussion and hearing about like the things that you look for, like elevators, I never thought about that because I don't need that. And people probably don't think about the level of noise or, you know, I was just thinking about that, like everyone's got their own stuff and everyone probably has different things on their mind that they're worried about or looking for. And I think with clients, we often bring up oppression or think about needing to address it when we know, like, okay, they're a different race or they're a different sexuality than us or not hetero or whatever it may be. But I haven't always been looking for these like invisible things, which are just as valid.
Sure. Thank you. And you also point out that, you know, not all disability even shows up the same, different things we have to think about. Anyone else? Yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, I want to be mindful of time. So I was just thinking in the conversation with Tammy and Susie also like just the complexities of existing, because when I look at my life now and the places where I'm in dominant spaces with privilege, the places where I'm oppressed almost become more dangerous for me. And so having access to some of these kind of dominant culture practices and places and work environments and those sorts of things sometimes elevate the intensity of the places where I'm oppressed, right? Because now I'm one of the only people in a room where I'm continuously coming out to a space, you know, of people, or, you know, so I'm always kind of like leveraging those two truths about, you know, yeah, there are these places where I'm not able to operate, but I think socially we really prioritize that space and say, hey, you're wanting to get there, right? You're wanting to get to a certain kind of work culture. You're wanting to get to a certain level of education. You're wanting to get to a certain housing neighborhood, you know, those sorts of things. But realistically, you know, when I move into those spaces, then the ways that I'm oppressed become more dangerous, right? So my partner and I bought a home a couple of years ago. And, you know, people, as a person who grew up in poverty, it was like a big deal, but it was terrifying because we were like, well, you don't know who your neighbor is, right? And so as we're introducing ourselves to our neighbors, we're having them to absorb the reaction and responses of people, right? When we've just spent a considerable amount of money and love and connection to be here. And what does that mean for our bodies and for our safety, right? Or we're having people come out to work on the house who are not willing to quote us something fairly because we have a sign in our front yard that says white supremacy is terrorism, because it is. Do you know what I mean? I'm not taking that sign out of my yard, but we had a contractor tell us that's why people aren't giving you this cost. And I said, well, shit, name what isn't making them treat me fairly. Do you know what I mean? Because often people will come to our home and it's palpable. They're uncomfortable. They're not able, they can't, you know, they're not pronouncing my partner's name correctly. They're asking if we're roommates. And I'm like, no, I'm full grown and this is a fucking house. Who buys a house with their roommate? Do you know what I mean? But it's like this level where it becomes more dangerous. And so I think when I'm in environments with folks who share some of my identities, it's safer, which to me almost is like heartbreaking, right? that feels connected to me. So, you know, I was just thinking about, you know, because obviously I'm holding lots of privilege in the world, you know, but anyway, that's my thought.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Sure. And I just want to say to that, you know, it's a stark experience to go into a place where either everybody looks like you or everybody has the same identity. And sometimes you don't even realize how difficult it is until you step into that environment and you're just like, wow, I'm not having to think about, you know, X, Y, and Z, whatever that is. And so it's a very different experience. Yes, Irene.
Thank you. I would like to share my experience was a little different than yours, Erica. In my family, especially my father used to scare us about the white people, the gringo, as we call it. Puerto Rico, he used to work with an American company, and every time that they have the CEO or the supervisor coming to the company, he used to be so scared oh my God, the gringo is coming. Oh my God. And in my life, I ever met a gringo until I moved here. So I have that anxiety. And every time that I try to go to a job interview, I have, oh my God, I'm going to be disliked. Not because I experienced that for myself in first person, but because of his experience. And even now, after I've been working here for 15 years, he's still amazed. Every time, and I share that with Jamie, every time that I do a workshop, oh, are they all gringos? Say, yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and the way that I see it, and this is the superpower with, and Dr. Kelly saying, I've been trying to transmit that to my nieces. And he said, you can do big things, and they are as good and as bad as we are. It's not because of they are gringos or no, it's like the human. So, yeah.
Thank you, Irene. Another way in which intergenerational trauma impacts us. And we take those things on, right? Yeah. No, it's been, let's see, how many years has it been? It's been 40 years, 40 something years since my dad came to this country, and he still talks about 2 jobs where he was turned down to get moved up. And he was literally told, it's because you're not white in the 70s. He came here with 12 bucks in his pocket, and he was lost, and he came to this land of opportunity, and he worked hard, and then they brought in somebody else when he should have been moved up, right? So, I think unfortunately a lot of the old types of racism are coming up, and we're seeing it more blatantly, and we're hearing it more blatantly, and it's a lot. But it's, it did become less popular to be that overtly racist, and now again it is considered okay to a lot of folks in America, unfortunately. Okay, office. Let's go ahead and do a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10:55 Eastern, and take a walk, get something to drink, take a bio break. We'll be back. Can people hear me on Zoom?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. All right, so hope everybody's been able to shake it off, move through. What's up? So thank you for your openness and your participation in that. I know, again, these are difficult things to talk about and think about, and we spend a lot of our time desensitized to it in that survival mode, but it's important to have these discussions. So thank you so much for your openness. So as we all know, oppression and trauma has an impact on our brain and body, right? When we're doing EMDR, we're taking into consideration the somatic piece. We talk at length about how our brain is impacted. Sorry, technical difficulties. Stand by, please. Okay, cool. Do you want me to share that? No. Okay, sounds good. All right. So the ongoing impact, some of you have spoken to the ongoing impact here today, looking for elevators, looking at the lights, thinking of different ways that you're impacted, coming into different spaces, right? Also intergenerational trauma, how that goes on and on, how it impacts us. What are the impacts on our DNA? You know, that's a whole nother conversation. Microaggressions, as I mentioned, I don't know about everybody else, but I have a little bit of thin skin to microaggressions lately. I think that there are times when we have more of a window of tolerance where it's a little bit easier to let that stuff roll off our back, but it still has an impact. Even if we are desensitized to it at the moment, there's still an impact. Health consequences, right? Long-term health consequences, chronic pain, chronic illness. Maybe that's not the cause of it, but it does exacerbate it, right? And also something that we know is that when we're under stress, our immune system drops, which means that we are then impacted by more, that we can get sick, that we can get tired, that we can have a hard time pushing through some of those harder things. And what are the multiple intersections? We talked about different things like going to an office building, work, different even social environments, right? There's so many different intersections that are happening in different environments. And for some, you might show up in an environment, or I might show up in an environment that's all queer, but maybe I'm the only person of color. And that really stands out to me. And I feel that. And I look around, and I think nobody else is thinking that. Mm-hmm. So when we experience trauma, when we experience oppression trauma, what happens to our system? We go into fight, we go into flight, we go into freeze, and fawning is a huge one. Fawning is partly masking, and also another layer of it is this survival. And it's so automatic, it just turns on, right? As you all are very aware, when we go into the sympathetic nervous system, we are not in control. We are not making decisions from a logical place. We are in survival mode. So how many of us live there most of the time? As soon as we step outside the house and see a neighbor, as soon as we have someone coming in to do work, as soon as we get in the car, we're driving, we've got to put on those shields. We've got to put a lot of protective stuff on for ourselves, right? And it can be exhausting. Psychological injury. Whether or not you experience mental illness, there's psychological injury when it comes to oppression. As I mentioned, physical, psychological, emotional pain that results from experiencing or witnessing oppression, discrimination, or violence, as I spelled it, against marginalized groups. So witnessing. I've had clients who were the only person of color in their family, and they were treated different. And that impacted their siblings who looked different than them because they saw that happening. And that they took that in as well. So it's not just experiencing it, it's also witnessing it, right? Even if somebody says something racist over there on that table in the restaurant, it does impact if I hear it, right? It does shift the vibe and the environment, and it is another microaggression or aggression rather. Ongoing and collective injuries from structural oppression, aggression, additional labor, exhaustion. Who's exhausted from talking about this stuff? It's tiring. I know we have to do it in a lot of environments, and we're choosing to do it today. And thank you for being here and putting your energy and effort, but it's emotional labor. And the thing about emotional labor and emotional exhaustion is that sleeping, resting does not necessarily get you to a place where you're not exhausted anymore. It just builds and builds and builds and compounds into itself. And then we're functioning in this state where we're exhausted and we're just pushing through. And we'll talk about burnout a little bit. When we talk about collective injuries, there's something to be said about that. Every year, I'm excited to go to Long Beach Pride and be in an environment where I don't have to look over my shoulder, where I don't have to worry about how someone is going to perceive me or interact with me or if I'm in danger. And that is when the stark contrast comes to, wow, this is different. Sometimes that's when you notice it, right? Experiencing and re-experiencing chronic stress, hypervigilance, right? Being on all the time, not being able to turn off, leading to what? Insomnia, other illnesses, things like that, right? I think when we are living in this constant state of fight in the sympathetic nervous system, we don't drop into the rest and digest, into the parasympathetic, which means what? People with complex trauma, people with oppression trauma have stomach issues sometimes, right? Insomnia, sleeping difficulties, difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep. There's a huge impact. And then how does that impact the body and the brain going forward? Made to feel unsafe, vulnerable, targeted simply for existing. Who's experienced that, right? So it's not traumatizing to be blank, fill in the blank. It's traumatizing to experience depression. It's not traumatizing to be queer or trans. As you pointed out, Erica, in your home, it was not traumatizing to be Black. And then you go out into the world and it's the oppression piece that's traumatizing. But again, gaslight, right? That's on you. That's just your experience. That's your perception. It's often flipped on that way, which that effectively does is it takes the element of the systemic institutionalized oppression out of the picture and blames you for your experience. So how do we deal with this? We got this huge problem. What do? Externalizing the problem is a huge part of the solution. Naming these systems, calling them out, identifying to others what's going on a deeper level. So in what ways are systems of oppression affecting my current situation? How are white supremacy, capitalism, racism, homophobia, sexism, misogyny, I'll add misogynoir, which is misogyny with anti-Blackness, transphobia, fat phobia, weight stigma, ableism, xenophobia, classism, elitism, that's one we haven't said, right? Casteism, Islamophobia, and the expectations of these systems. How are they affecting me in my life? And it's a personal pet peeve when people say the isms, because it's very, it's minimizing. These all don't go together. The ones I named off and more. They represent different experiences. And so that's why in a lot of ways talking about it as oppression, although that word is very strong, I think that's why it's easier for some folks to just say it's the isms. And if you weren't aware of that, you know, that is something that is invisibilizing experience. So using the word oppression is a little bit more helpful. So how do we face these layers of oppression? What does that look like? Oppression is an effective way of keeping people silent, as these views could mean extremely negative consequences. So what is that impact? Sometimes it's the loss of relationships. Who's lost a friend who's made a comment that's been like, yeah, like, that comment, even if it wasn't about me, was not okay. How many people have called out their friends and they've not responded well, right? Loss of support for education. That's one of the first thing that goes. There is still a huge, huge problem with access to education. Loss of work and financial stability, shame in the community, physical threats to safety, literal physical threats. Loss of reputation, threat of law enforcement, criminal justice, ICE, DCFS involvement, stands for the Department of Children and Family Services. And ICE stand. I'm like, are we bleeping this out? No. Synonymous with assholes, yes. So other layers. In the last few years, we've been greatly impacted by the pandemic. Some people more so than others, right? We've lost our routines and schedules, which I don't know about some of you, but that lends to safety, right? If I know what's coming and I know what to expect, then it allows me to have a little bit of a safety. Connection, physical touch. That has greatly impacted a lot of folks. I live alone. The only people I was hugging through the pandemic were my family. And when they piss me off, then they're, you know. But it's true. We've had that disconnection happen. The celebration of important events, holidays, milestones, right? These are the things that kind of bring some ease to some of the more difficult things. And that was just off the table. It's coming back, but still. Community support, quality time with loved ones, people getting sick, people having to quarantine, not being able to see certain friends and family. I have a friend with multiple chemical sensitivities who can't go to certain places and is also like, I don't know who you've seen. I don't know where you went. I don't know if you wore a mask. How do I know if you're going to keep me safe? Time to myself, grounding, autonomy, because we're on Zoom all the time. No.
So it did to me.
Yeah. Needed services, resources, and accommodations. How did this look for unhoused folks? Right? Lots of people not being able to go to work when there are needed resources, loss of access, evictions, moving, not being at school. How many kids were at home in abusive environments being told, sit there and Zoom? A kid I know was like, my dad made me do the dishes and vacuum during my recess. Most parents are not equipped to be their kids' teachers. I mean, some are wonderful. I don't know how parents worked during the pandemic. It was terrible for the kids. It was terrible for the parents. Kids flunking left and right. Kids being cyberbullied. Health, loss of life, getting COVID, losing loved ones, not even being able to say goodbye to people in the hospital. It's been a lot. It's been a huge impact on us. So when we talk about all of this, it is important to notice that there are very intentional tactics to oppression. And as you look at this list, emotional abuse, right? We just talked about gaslighting. That happens a lot. Economic abuse, isolation, the privilege of status, using children, minimizing, denying, and blaming, and gaslighting, right? Similar things. Intimidation and threats, using violence. What does this look like to folks? Have you seen a similar list? Maybe that looks like this. The wheel of power and control. We talk about domestic violence or intimate partner violence. This is what we're talking about. This is what this looks like. And it goes across levels. This doesn't have to be intimate partner violence. This can be violence at work, violence out in the community. These things occur a lot. Oh, you're exposing your children to that? Wow. You know, things like that. Utilizing privilege, that power over, as we talked about. By the way, we will be taking a lunch break at 12 noon Eastern until 1:30 p.m. Eastern. So we'll go for another 45. So here's a wheel of equality. What does this look like? If you look back at this one, there's physical and sexual violence around the ends. And that's all part of it at different times. When we talk about intimate partner violence, less than 5% of the violence is physical. And that's why it doesn't get named. And that isolation is a very important part of being able to continue to abuse someone. Because if they get enough space from that, they might realize that this isn't okay. And how much does that show up with oppression? How much are we entrenched in it every single day? How much do we have to desensitize? So on this wheel, this is surrounded by nonviolence. How do we do this, guys? There's a lot of things that we can point out that are not okay. So using non-threatening behavior, right? Talking and acting so that the person feels safe, comfortable expressing themselves, doing things interpersonally, in large groups, whatever that looks like. Respect, trust and support, honesty and accountability. Transparency is one of my favorite words because there's honesty and then there's transparency, and those are different things. Honesty is selective. Transparency is here it is. What I know, you should know. That's what I tell my associates. There's nothing I should know that you don't know. Responsible parenting. Even raising kids to understand these concepts. Raising kids to recognize things on the playground. You know what? That's not okay. If some kid calls another kid something, get a teacher. How do you intervene? How do you talk about these things? We don't learn that in school. We don't learn conflict management in school, conflict resolution. It'd be good to, it'd be nice to. Shared responsibility. And this is like accountability to the next level, right? How do we work on this together to find a solution? Economic partnership. Supporting folks to have access. Seeing people for their socioeconomic status, even though a lot of times that's masked as well. Recognizing, oh, this so-and-so doesn't ever go to lunch with us. I wonder why. They always bring the same lunch. That's interesting. Okay. Right? Oh, they probably just don't like us. Well, maybe there's more going on there. Negotiation and fairness. How do we compromise? Again, who teaches us about compromise? We don't learn this in school. We don't learn actual life skills, I would argue. All right, so let's take a minute. Just unclench your jaw. Mine is ever clenched, so I like this image. Relax your shoulders, drop them back into your back pocket. Take a breath. I invite you to. Maybe even sigh. Take it out. Lots of stuff, lots of stuff. Even to be in our bodies in this moment is hard. All right, we're about to dive into some heavy stuff too, again. So I want to break down certain categories here of oppression. So I'm going to go a little bit into depth with certain things. And by no means is this all inclusive. As I mentioned, we could be here for months talking about this. Let's talk about queer and trans folks. So at least one LGBTQ young person attempts suicide every 45 seconds. In the time it took me to say this and the last slide, one person has attempted. This is totally unacceptable. This is rampant. LGBTQ plus folks are overrepresented in unhoused populations, in addiction populations, in foster care populations, which is a direct pipeline to prisons. 40% of kids in foster care are LGBTQ plus. We are not 40% of the population. And then that then goes on to imprisonment, those high numbers. And it's no mistake that there is a pipeline from the foster care system to the prison system. What is it about? Right? Privatization, money. How many people are out there going to weed dispensaries while so-and-so is locked up because they're brown or black and they're still sitting in that cell? And somebody's making money off of them. It's disturbing. So what does it mean? Who wants to take a stab at it? LGBTQIAAP2S plus. Go ahead, Mike. Oh, let me give you this.
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, ally, poly, two-spirit, and damn, I'm running out on an S.
That's it. You got it. I think sometimes the second A is ally. Sometimes it is agender. And then P is sometimes pansexual, which you said poly, but which I think it could be. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list either. 2 is two-spirit, which is largely something used in the Native community and frankly should not be used by anybody. And I've seen a lot of co-opting of that. And I've heard a lot of calling in people around that. Yeah, actually, I'm going to show you on the next slide here. There you go. So two-spirit is not on here. L is lesbian. Why is L first? Anybody?
Because the lesbians took care of the game.
Thank you, because the lesbians took care of the gay men during the AIDS epidemic. And so instead of it being I can't even say it, GLBT, it was switched at that time. I also think that there is something to be said for the fact that often people will just say, this is the alphabet. I can't get all those numbers. I can't get all those letters. It's too much. I'll just say alphabet soup. We fought hard for these letters. We found it really hard to be seen. My mentor, who's passed now, hated the word queer. She was 83 years old when she passed. And In her day, queer was what was yelled at you on the street. You're queer as a $3 bill. And that was the thing that was life threatening. And so these youths came in and they're like, this is too long. I don't want all this stuff. Can we just say queer? Sure, but guess what? Not everybody likes that word and not everybody identifies with that word. And I'll tell you another thing, that when we say gay for everyone as an umbrella term or queer for everyone, who is being invisibilized? Folks of color, women or AFAB people, right? Trans folks, non-binary folks. And by the way, let me go back to the flag here. If you'll notice, this is an inclusive flag with the black and brown that's been added to it. You also see the trans colors, which are white, pink, and blue. And the yellow with the circle is the newest addition, which is for non-binary folks. And actually each of the colors in the flag represent different things when they were created. Which I'm a bad queer, and I don't know. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I did have someone in training who knew all of it. And I was like, wow, you're putting me to shame. So why is it important to have all of these words? Why do we need questioning them? Why is that important, right? It's valid, it's complicated, you are part of our community. It's important to recognize that folks who are questioning belong as well. Because you don't know your label yet, doesn't matter. Yeah. Wait, hold on. Okay. It takes straightness out of the center.
I think if you're working with that queer population, the word diet sometimes comes out, or there's certain words that come up. Or people who had a different historical context, really like Dyke. I remember someone I used to date, we were at like a big rally and I had a Dyke sign. I don't know. And their uncle was very much like, absolutely not, do not take that sign, do you know? But we all know reflecting language, but there are certain words that have historical context that was very scary, was very violent, was used in a harmful way. And so, you know, reflecting language, but also doing some of that research on your own. There's some terms that are real heavy historically.
Thank you. It's my favorite word, dyke. Well, and dyke is one of those words that's been reclaimed because it was very negative and it was very harmful, but it was taken back and it now represents, I want to say lesbian, because I'll tell you that a lot of folks of color will say lesbian is very white. I don't identify as a lesbian. I identify as queer or a dyke. To me, when I say dyke or somebody says dyke to me, I know you're political. And I think there's this assumption that if you're a lesbian, you're automatically political. That is very far from the truth. Mm-hmm.
I've been part of some active controversy with folks who don't believe allies should be part of the umbrella. And I don't know if this is one where there's going to be a consensus opinion or feeling, but it is something I've entertained as criticism before, including allies in the community.
Thank you. That's a great point. I think when we talk about allies, it depends. It depends to me. Like, yes, I have a feeling sometimes that, well, why is ally in there, right? Because as an ally, you typically have privilege, right? So why are you listed on here? But there are some allies who go above and beyond. The best ally is the one that I don't even know what their sexual orientation is, because it does not matter, because they feel like community and they show up and they understand and they take the time to be part of the community.
And the follow-up point I often make on this, and people inevitably see it differently, is especially if you grow up in a conservative Christian bubble, you run a great risk being an ally. A lot of us came out as allies before we even came out as questioning, before we came out as bike or dyke or whatever. So I get a lot of the criticism. It's like, I'm an ally and it's performative. And it's like, you know, maybe you don't belong here, et cetera, et cetera. But at least this is my lived experience, that it is a risk to come out as ally first. And then that was my process, ally, questioning, and then full on bike bee up there.
Yeah, great point. What kind of flack do you take as an ally when you stop someone from saying something homophobic or transphobic? Does someone assume that you're part of the community, and do you correct them? How important is it to correct them? Right? The gender unicorn. This stuff is complex, people. We need a little unicorn to explain it to us. Okay. So let's start with gender identity. That's the little cloud with the little rainbow. All of these are spectrums. Everything is a spectrum. Spectrum is my second favorite word. No, I'm just kidding. No, dyke. Oh, third favorite word. Shit. Okay, so along gender identity lines, are you a female, meaning are you biological sex that you're with? A woman and a girl, is that lined up? Are you male, a man, a boy, or are you another gender? Right? And that's how we identify, and that's why it shows a bubble for the brain, because gender is a construct in our mind. Gender is not what we're born with. Biological sex is, right? So let me skip down to sex assigned at birth. You see this little DNA helix thingy, right? And that is female, male, or guess what? Ambiguous genitalia. I'm not sure if folks are aware, but typically the medical field takes infants into surgery to do corrective surgery to have them fit into one or the other. Why do we need our biological sex on our birth certificate? Or anything? I'm going to argue it's for oppression's sake. Oh, I know what category you go in, so I know how to treat you. Right? To gender expression. This is the dots all around. This is how I show up, right? This is how I represent myself. This is clothing and hair and what that looks like. There's feminine, masculine, androgynous, other. And then you'll see two hearts in the middle. Who am I physically attracted to? Women, men, non-binary folks, trans men, trans women. Who am I emotionally attracted to, right? All the genders can come into place. So these are separate constructs, and they don't always line up in the ways that society thinks that they should, maybe, or that society imposes upon us, I could say. So I like to break this down because I don't want to assume everybody knows this. I think sex and gender are the most conflated thing, and people do not understand that we don't come into this world with a gender that is imposed upon us. Pronouns. This is something that's coming up a lot, and a lot of folks are having a hard time, and it takes practice, and we make mistakes, but it is important to acknowledge people and how they identify. So what are pronouns? How we refer to ourselves, how other people refer to us, he, she, they, them, Zeezer. Who's heard that? Zeezer. Yeah, that's an older one, but it's coming back, I think. Why is it important? Using someone's pronoun shows your respect for their gender identity, and them as a person using the wrong pronoun can hurt. It invisibilizes people. Dead naming people, calling them a name they no longer identify with. Happens a lot. So what can you do? Ask people what their pronoun is, just as you'd ask them, what would you like me to call you? Now, previously people were saying preferred pronouns, but now people are just calling it pronouns. It's not preferred, it's just my pronoun. That's how I identify, right? Preferred implies that I'm making the choice to do this, but really it's how I see myself. So I'm actually just really aligning who I am with who I show to the world and how I show up in the world. Use the pronoun that people ask you to. When you make a mistake, which you will, and that's okay, just say, excuse me, I'm sorry, and then use the correct pronoun. If I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, oh no, I've offended you, then what happens? They have to take care of your feelings now, and it's not about them again. Mistakes are opportunities to grow. We're going to make them. We just have to plan for, okay, when I make a mistake, this is how I'm going to handle it. I have a friend I'm training to use they, them with someone in our friend circle. And she's tripping over the words and not necessarily using them grammatically correctly. And it takes practice. So every time I see her, I refer to everybody as they, them. Right? I don't use other pronouns with her because I want her to hear it over and over. The more you say it, the more it rolls off your tongue. We make a lot of assumptions about gender, about pronouns, about people in general. And I would argue that some of that might be a survival instinct to make an assessment quickly, but we don't need that type of survival instinct, right? That's not necessary to make this judgment and to be like, okay, I have to categorize this person and put them into a box. Including your email and your signature, or when you're in a Zoom meeting. It just shows I see you. I hear that not everybody uses the gender that, you know, they're not, maybe they're not cis.
I think the other thing that I've been trying to shift towards thinking about more is like this myth of objectivity in language, right? And I think in the way that like colonialism affected the way in which people were able to refer to themselves and to each other, you know, and so we have this limited lexicon that we've established as normal, or like, this is the only word I can use. This is, what else am I supposed to do? That's a plural, not a singular, which one is factually false. But, you know, and so I think like seeing the ways in which colonialism has shifted our capacity to even relate to each other and has taken language from communities that previously held space for people, and understanding like that kind of violence also when people feel lost and they're like, well, I don't have another word. And I'm like, I know, but we did. And then someone took it. So anyway.
Thank you. Great point. And language matters so much. It impacts us so much. Right. And so you could say those are microaggressions, but again, I think they're macro.
I apologize if I missed this when I stepped out, but I hope since we're on a pronoun slide, you could shed some light on this based on a discussion we had at the team meeting yesterday, or attempted to have a discussion. We were kind of running low on time and I was dissociated. But I have long struggled with, like, I am cool identifying my pronouns. I see the validity of everything you're saying. But even when that started to become more the standard practice, I had concerns, Mike, like about what you said yesterday. Does it almost become like a peer pressure? Like, go around the room and say, my name is so-and-so, my pronouns are. Does it force somebody to come out before they're ready to come out? What if people don't know what their pronouns are yet? So I had a little bit of discomfort, even like amongst the ICM team, about saying like, you know, it's an expectation or you have to put your pronouns on the website. and this is where, you know, if I'm honestly calling myself on my shit, I get caught in between like, what's the most woke thing to do? Because I really do want to do the right thing, but also appreciate that may be different for every person. And like, what is our expectation as leaders? And what does it say about me that I care about being judged for not being woke enough? Like, again, that's my shit here, but I wanted to see your take on that discussion we had yesterday.
Thank you. And, you know, we do have the woke Olympics, right? So who's entering this year? Anybody here? Aaron is. No. I mean, I think that we can one up each other and we can be like, well, I'm more woke because I have my pronouns, but you're absolutely right. I will personally say that I had some resistance initially to putting pronouns in my email because I like that you can't tell what gender I am from my email. You can't Roshni, I don't know. Alien gender. Well, it's like, who cares, you know? And so I was like, I don't want to identify my biological sex or my gender identity. You don't see my gender identity in my email. And yes, I've decided to then add it, but I do think there's a layer here that is not being addressed, which is exactly right. What if you don't know your pronouns? What if you're not out about it? One of my pet peeves is everybody assumes I'm non-binary or that I want to be trans because I'm masculine leaning in my presentation. And that's not true. So I think that there is this pressure to be like, I'm a she, her. And there is this feeling on Zoom where it's like, okay, here I go in this room with a bunch of folks I don't know. And now I'm making them feel comfortable to know what pronoun to use with me. There's a little irk there for me where I'm just like, I think I want you to be a little uncomfortable sometimes. That's kind of my thing, you know? Yeah.
On what kind of ICM institutional policy should be about people who represent ICM using pronouns, or how we handle it with our trainees. Because how I do it in trainings is I invite you to put your pronouns on your Zoom tag if you choose, but I personally don't judge people if they don't. But I know there are other people who are like, they didn't use their pronouns, so they must be a conservative Christian, and I don't want us getting into that either.
And I think pronouns, they're not necessarily new. I'm going to show you in a minute. They're not new, but they're more widespread now. And so there is a lot of different pressure than we had before. So, I mean, my answer off the top of my head is consent culture, opt in, opt out. I think inviting people is a good way to allow themselves. And if folks are judging you or saying, well, you didn't do this, so you must be X, Y, and Z. Again, it's missing the nuance there of different experience. And so part of the thing is when we make choices for ourselves, we also have to respect that other people are going to make their own choices and that we can internalize why they made that choice, but we might not be right.
Dr. Kelly saying in chat, forget woke. How conscious and aware are we about who we are, and how do we respect where people are in their own identity development?
Absolutely. How do we respect that? How do we represent that? I'm okay with you, whoever you are. Right? It makes people uncomfortable that I don't use they, them pronouns sometimes. And I'm like, what is it to you? That doesn't resonate with me. It resonates with other people, and that's great. But making an assumption about that also makes me feel unseen. Right? Like, did I speak to that? Yeah, how do we really allow others to be in their identity fully without judgment? And I think the answer to that often is to do it ourselves and to role model that for others.
I will just say, I think there's a difference between judgment and accountability, right? And so I think you can make whatever choice that you want, and the way that it impacts and affects the people around you is a space where you had the to be accountable to that and to engage in dialogue about it, right? And so I think safety, marginalized person, historically targeted, where you are using certain cues to establish safety around discussion and identity and existence. And so I think often for me, I'm like, hey, I don't anything not included pronouns if you're in a position to be accountable in social spaces, right? Not willing to just kind of hold the space of benevolence. Happen to of in something as importance. And so I think the complexity or way to talk again of account own that, because transparency where people can then make decisions about how comfortable or safe or interested they are and bringing their vulnerability to you, which to me feels more, it feels
Absolutely. I think that when we're talking about judgment versus accountability is active, it's interactive. Judgment is, I see you, I think you're X, Y, and Z, and that's it. And there's no room for conversation, connection, change, or growth. It leaves all of that out. But when there's an accountability, you could easily say, hey, I'm just curious, why didn't you put your pronouns up there? That's a different question than where are your pronouns, right? I mean, that's a very different question. It invites in, let me hear about your experience. And don't we all want that? Don't we all want to be seen for who we are and what our experience has been? And that's a good point too. Exactly. So Mike says, I don't always want to share my experience with you. You might be intruding. You might be intruding on me and my process. And I don't know who you are. And especially if you come at me hard, I'm going to be like, I don't have to answer to you, right? But accountability invites in discussion. Well, okay, let me say, ideally, accountability invites in discussion and compassion, hopefully. And hopefully it's not punitive, because a lot of times accountability turns into something punitive and shaming and problematic. And then what are we doing except taking on the role of the oppressor?
I like that aspect of curiosity. Lisa and I had a random conversation last night, and opening, hey, I'm curious, then allows that person to have the opportunity to go, you know what? Yeah, let me check myself, or, I fucked up, or whatever it is. Because if you come at it like, did you actually just say what I think you just said? Versus, oh, I'm curious. And I'm like, oh shit, yeah, you're right. It just gives a bit of ease to a conversation instead of an immediate defense from that other individual.
Absolutely. Yet another one of my favorite words, wondering. I tell my associates, when in doubt, you don't know what to say, you can just be like, I'm wondering about how that impacts you. I mean, wondering sounds like wonderment. It sounds so lovely. Rather than, are you this? Right? It can be really harsh, some of the ways that we call people out. And if you say, I'm curious about, I'm wondering about, I even like this, I'm having a paranoid fantasy that you. That's a good one in the workplace. Are you having one now? Yeah, thank you all. Thank you. Good conversation, good discussion. So here are some gendered pronouns that we use very often. She, her, hers. The pronunciation is cracking me up. He, him, his, she, him, his. There's got to be like a buzz at the end there. And then some gender neutral ones, which some you're very familiar with, they, them, theirs. Back before that existed, a lot of people went by Z, here, here's, Z, zir, zirs, zem, zem, zers. It's a mouthful. 3 times fast. Yeah. And People look at this list and they're like, oh crap. That whole thing. I'm gonna stay out of the conversation. I'm gonna be quiet because I don't want to say something that gets me in trouble. That's a very common reaction, especially when we're talking about pronouns.
One of my family members told me once and really appreciated how often I just use their name. Because, right, there's no mixing that up. There's no, and it's more of who they authentically felt like they were.
Thank you. Yeah. Using the person's name. I knew somebody in about 2005 whose pronoun was monkey in San Francisco, of course. And that was really hard. It was really hard to get it right every time. And it would be like tripping over your words. But that was what this person was asking. And it was a relevant ask.
Well, you had mentioned earlier about dyke being, you see it as a political term, right? And that's what resonates with you. I've seen non-binary folks often use it in the very same way, right? It's this pronoun shit is bullshit. I hate you guys. And this is, I'm going to make a statement about this, right? But the other thing, I think, by not using people's pronouns and using their name, sometimes that makes it more blatant that because I've seen family members do that when it's, I don't accept your gender, so I'm going to walk around it in this way. So it can go either way.
And that can be very clunky and very obvious also. Mm-hmm. So ask people their pronouns. That's the take-home message here. Ask them, try to use them, apologize when you get it wrong, try again. People will appreciate that, especially if you don't put your feelings about it on them as well. Mm-hmm. All right. Some questions to think about. What do you think caused your heterosexuality? For the heterosexual folks, you're like, nothing. Nothing. Mike said my parents tried to cause it, but didn't work somehow. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When and how did you first decide you were heterosexual? Is it possible that your heterosexuality is just a phase you might grow out of? It was. For some of us, it was. Oh boy. Did I miss something? Wait, hang on a second.
So my parents ruined my coming out by being like, yes, we know. We knew when you were 8, when you made your Barbies make out and you put your Kens in the freezer. I've come out many other times, so they weren't trying to do anything to me. They just couldn't. But whenever I see the word heterosexual, I just go, ew, why would you choose that? That's yes.
One of my associates sent me a meme the other day saying something like, the fact that I'm attracted to men says that it's not a choice. She's bisexual. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Steve, we're at the slap happy phase of the morning. It says, I'm bisexual because women are awesome. And I'm also attracted to making poor choices, which is why I like men.
It's, yes, dark humor. We love it. We love it. To whom have you disclosed your heterosexual tendencies and how did they react? Opposite sex attractions. Yeah. In the ex-gay conversion therapy world. Mm-hmm. Yep. Why do you insist on being so obvious and making a public spectacle of your heterosexuality? Can't you just be who you are and keep it quiet? Why are you so flamboyantly straight? Why are you rubbing your straight fitness in my face? Exactly. Beck said, at least act gay in front of me. Mike said, why are you flaunting your heterosexuality? So what's funny about these questions? We don't ask these questions, and it makes it so ridiculous when you think about the questions that are asked of LGBTQ plus folks. It makes it ridiculous because it is. It's a spectrum. The way that our brain develops, our attraction, it's complicated, right? It's not just one way or another way. There's a lot of pieces in the spectrum that different people identify with. There's a whole questionnaire too. These are just a select few questions, but if you're interested in taking this quiz for yourself, let me know. Shifting gears here to talk about something that is very prevalent for us right now. Actually, you know what? Let's maybe stop here before. Yes. Yeah, so we're going to take a lunch break in a minute here. Let me hand it back to Jamie for a quick announcement. We'll be on an hour and a half lunch break.
Yes, so we resume at 1:30 Eastern, and the announcement I actually have two announcements. I want to humbly apologize for my harriedness this morning. I don't know what word to call it. I've been very flustered with the technology situation here and trying to run this as a healthy hybrid event, and I think we're now in a good flow, and I've loved this training, so thank you all for your patience with me. Some of you heard last night, my partner was hospitalized overnight. I hate to say it's not a big deal, but it happens a lot with his chronic condition. So he's actually discharged. I have to go pick him up over lunch. We're still good to have you at the house tonight because, and I may have to discuss this later with him, he's going to work tonight. So he's like, yeah, let him come over. So so I think 6:30 is our gathering time tonight at the house. The one thing we kind of wanted to ask from me, and I had a blast last night, and I'll be even more present tonight knowing he's okay. So I hope you can join us out at the barn. As you know, we have a lot of Mexican food left over. If some of you still have your heart set on pizza, I'm planning on ordering a couple pizzas still, but if you can by the first break kind of give me your requests, like I know we have some vegans, some vegetarians in the group. I usually just go with like a standard cheese, a standard pepperoni, maybe a standard mixed veggie. I know I kind of want pizza tonight, so yeah, just let me know what you're thinking in terms of food, or when we get back to the house, Beck and Alicia could turn the oven on and start dinner. So any thoughts on Mexican or pizza tonight? And everyone else, if you want to put what your choice would be if you were here, we would love to know. We just can't pass it through. So Paula says pizza, please. So yes. Your dinner pronoun is pizza. All right. Well, we could do both. Like Rachel and Irene and I say often, ¿por qué no los dos? So we'll, I like both. That's from a song called The Bisexual Anthem, which I highly recommend. Sorry? Domo is her name. So we may have to play it over break in the afternoon. So yes, just I'll order a couple pizzas, but if you can give me your requests by mid-afternoon and we'll have another good time. We can get ranch dressing. I'll give you some bucks and you can get your ranch dressing. That would help us out tremendously. Have a good lunch, everyone. 1:30.